Alright, so hello one and all, welcome back to another Mushoku Tensei episode review, where I go over the manga and light novel, discussing everything that the anime covered and everything that it skipped, because there is a lot, and in this case, kind of a lot, but I'm not covering it this time. I'll explain what I mean, but for now, let's move on to the manga. It's really hard to talk about the manga's adaptation, because it's like really different. Literally, I opened up a page and it shows Rudeus and Eris fighting some random guards. That doesn't happen. The entire section of this, like, this half of the book just doesn't happen in the anime. Or in the light novel for that matter. So what I'm going to do is save that for another time. I don't know when I'll be posting it, but I'll be posting a video at some point talking about the manga's version of these events. So that means that this episode and next episode, I just won't be covering the manga. Because it would be kind of weird, like, yeah, there's some like little plot points that gets dragged out throughout episodes, and like some of you kind of have to watch multiple of these reviews to understand little tiny things, like Ruger's friend, right? He's brought up in multiple episode reviews. I think 2 or 3 of them actually. But that's something minor. Then there's this where it's like you'd have to literally watch the entire manga review, and then like its point is I'll make a video about it. Yeah, and so I'll just make another video talking about this like exact part of the manga at some other point in time if any of you are interested. I don't know when I'm gonna get that out, but I'll get it out eventually. And so let's move on to the light novel. But now Rudeus is 12, and he didn't even know that his birthday had passed, but apparently it did at some point. He thinks back about the past 2 years of travel and figures that the worst has passed, and moving forward it should be a smooth ride. And from a narrative standpoint, this is such an interesting thing to do, right? Throw the protagonist into one of the most harshest scenarios possible, and then just make it easier as time goes on. Like, of course, where the author removes the physical danger, he does replace it with emotional danger and anxiety for the future. And of course, we know that Dead End's trip to Firoa isn't exactly smooth, but still, it's very interesting how it really is. They're at the most difficult part at the beginning, and then they kind of just, it gets easier as time goes on. Kind of weird, but I like it. So now in Eastport, Dead End booked an inn and discussed their next plan. There are 3 routes that they can take to Asura. 1 is go west around the Dragon King mountain range, 2 is go east around the Mountain Dragon range through the forest, or 3 is to go through the Begret continent. Going west around the mountains might not be the shortest route, but it's better than the other 2. Because although going through the forest is technically less distance traveled, traversing through the forest on foot would take much longer than going east on the main road. And going through the Begret continent would be the longest and most dangerous. Much like the Demon continent, it's very condensed with mana, and so there'd be plenty of monsters. With the abundance of labyrinths that mess with the weather, the fact that it's 99% desert, and the fact that there are pretty strong monsters, it's an obvious no, although Eris calls Rudeus a coward for not wanting to go through it. But then he says that, well, if we'd have to go to the Begret continent, we'd have to take a boat, and she's immediately convinced. The Begret continent sounds stupid anyway, right? And so they opt to take the easiest route around the Dragon King mountain range to get to the Asura kingdom. And that night, Rudeus is visited with a vision of Hitogami. He tells Rudeus about Lily and Aisha, but there's a bit more to it in this. It's kind of implied that Rudeus forgets his reincarnated life whenever he's in the void. Kind of. Like, he does remember his life, but it's as though, like, morally he reverts back to his previous life self. Maybe it's because he's just in his old body, his mind is kind of just, like, not feeling the best. But he becomes just a lot more toxic whenever he's in the void for some reason. But Rudeus is annoyed how Hitogami just pops up out of nowhere. He thinks that maybe Hitogami can only visit him once a year, but then he remembers the first time that he and Hitogami met. After that, he showed up like a week later. And so Rudeus asks about that, and Hitogami explains that he can only show up in the dreams of someone who's on the same wavelength as he is, and there aren't many like that. And the condition in order to do that is unknown to Hitogami. And so he just gets this like sudden feeling of, this guy's the one, today is the time. And it's only then that he's able to link up. And when Hitogami asks Rudeus to trust him if this advice goes well for Rudeus, Rudeus says that he just won't trust him. But he will stop arguing with Hitogami whenever he's like brought into the void. and he'll just shut up and listen to his advice. But anyway, Hitogami shows Rudeus the future through his demon eye, and right before he leaves, Hitogami says, "Oh, was that a little bit too much detail? If I tell you too much, it'll spoil my fun, so that'll have to do. Now then, I wonder which one you'll get along with." And so, I'll be honest, I don't exactly know what Hitogami is talking about here. But literally now, in the moment, because I'm like, what is he talking about? Lilia and Aisha? Like, which one will he get along with? I don't know. But now that I think about it, it might be the princes, right? Because Pax is so similar to Rudeus, I wonder if there's another timeline out there where, like, Rudeus and Pax kind of, like, become buds and understand each other a little bit. But obviously we know that he chooses the other brother, Zenoba. I don't know, I just think that's interesting. Because I wonder if that is what Hitogami's implying, because there's nobody else really. What would the timeline be like if Rudeus and Pax became friends? Because both Pax and Zenoba are really affected by Rudeus's life in ways that I will not explain. But I do wonder, what would happen if he became friends with Pax instead? That's a what if that I might have to explore one day. As Rudeus woke up, he had a massive headache and threw up, and it's the same kind of headache that he'd get whenever he'd overextend his capabilities of the Eye of Foresight, confirming Rudeus' suspicions of how Hitogami showed him the visions. It was definitely through his demon eye. Rudeus then realizes that it was almost godlike intuition on Hitogami's part, or rather it was all part of his plan, for Rudeus to not only run into Kishirika like Hitogami wanted, but also to choose the exact eye that Hitogami also wanted. It really does feel like that Hitogami is making careful preparations for something. With this much foresight, no pun intended because the Eye of Foresight, Rudeus for the first time started to fear Hitogami. He felt as though that Hitogami, being with an undefined form and incredible power, was trying to use him for something, and that sent a chill down his spine. And all while this is happening, Rudeus wakes up and asks Rudeus what's wrong, to which he says that he's just feeling ill because of his eye. But because of how pale he is, Rudeus isn't exactly convinced, and he asks him again. Rudeus nearly blurted out everything, that ever since meeting Rudeus, Hitogami had been monitoring him and giving him advice. But then he realized something. All of this started right before Rudeus met Rudeus. He thinks that since Hitogami said that he can only communicate with certain people, he's using Rudeus to get to Rudeus, to make him do something. Hitogami found Rudeus, he did the Monocalamity to send Rudeus to the Demon Continent, to make him trust Rudeus, all to go to the Asura Kingdom? Or maybe it's something else, and why give him advice to save Aisha and Lilia? It just didn't make sense. And so Rudeus just ignores Rudeus' question and says that if he were ever in a difficult situation and someone whispers honeyed words in your ear, do not believe a word that they say. Rudeus kind of goes like, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about, but like, sure, okay kid. Rudeus then soon returned to his room and crawled back into bed, but he couldn't fall asleep. Just then, he heard Eris mumble, "What is it?" And Eris, sprawled out in the bed next to him, was talking in his sleep. For those curious, Eris, I guess, wears shorts and a t-shirt to bed. And that's it, if you understand what I'm meaning. And we get some interesting commentary from Rudeus that I'm not going to talk about. But Eris has her legs spread wide open with her arms kind of up, exposing her belly button. And so Rudeus gets out of bed, pulls her shirt down, and readjusted her blanket over top of her. And then she spoke again. "Rudeus is a perv," with a dirty look on her face, and here he was making himself worried sick about her while she still calls him a perv even in her sleep. But then for some reason, as Rudeus returns to bed, exhaustion takes over him immediately and he falls asleep. And now the next day at breakfast, Rudeus announced that they are going to stop by the Shrone Kingdom, and both Rudeus and Eris are a little confused but nod their heads and didn't question it. But then Eris says, "Isn't that the place where your master lives?" And it seemed like both she and Rudeus were interested in meeting Roxy. And so there wasn't really any complaints about stopping by there. And so with that, they set off for the Shrone Kingdom. They traveled along a highway that took them straight through Wyvern, the capital of the King Dragon realm. They originally wanted to only spend 3 days in Wyvern before setting off for the East Pass around the mountains, but their carriage had broken down and it took them 7 days to repair it. Rudeus wanted to get to Sharon as fast as possible, but then realized that it could be something like fate that will allow Rudeus to meet Aisha right on time. And so that means that no matter how much Rudeus rushes things, he wouldn't meet Aisha before the time is right. And we find out that the King Dragon Realm is the third largest country in the world and is the largest in the southern part of the central continent, with 4 vassal states under it. Originally, this country was just another small country before it took over the King Dragon Mountains and killed their leader, Kajakt, the monarch of the King Dragons. Pretty badass. From there, the economy boomed and raised their resources and power. This was also the origin of the 48 magical swords that were now scattered across the world, as well as one of the locations mentioned in a line of the Epic of the North God, some kind of novel about one of the North gods. And despite the rich history for this country, Rudeus notes that it feels very much like America, where there isn't really much tradition and it's kind of a mix of different elements. And this country mostly taught the North God style and the Water God style, but it was basically like your children's karate classes that you might have taken. Just no real talent there, right? It's just a bunch of kids getting exercise, essentially. But as Rudeus was checking the market for whatever he could find, he came across some raw rice. And although Rudeus already had some rice at Randolph, the Death God's restaurant, if you missed that, you definitely you skipped out on my last video, because yeah, we've met the Death God already. One of the 7 great powers. Pretty crazy. Rudeus almost starts a fight with him. So if you want to see how that encounter went, check out the previous video. But now with like actual raw rice that he can cook himself, he can make it exactly how he wants it to be. And so a few hours later in the inn's garden, Rudeus was prepared with 4.5 grams of rice, cooking utensils he'd made, an outdoor stove, a recipe that the pub owner taught him, eggs and salt. Eris was curious about what he was doing, and Rudeus simply said, "It's an experiment." And so Eris kind of tried to act uninterested, kind of just swinging her arms at her side. This isn't a good example of what she was doing, but I just don't have room. You know, just swinging her arms, you know, like that. I can't. I don't want to stand up right now. I'm too lazy. But as she did that, she kept glancing in Rudeus's direction, obviously a little bit more curious than she let on. And now what's interesting here is the directions say that the trick to cooking rice is to slowly turn up the heat. No idea if that's true, but what's more interesting is Rudeus does the exact opposite of that. So again, it might be just a little translation issue. But he has an hourglass that he flips, and every time he does, he lowers the heat until like the rice is perfectly cooked. And so I've tried making rice before in the past, and it's never went well. And so I've actually tried like doing this trick a few times, and like I don't know if it's good, but it's rice that I enjoy. It's rice that you have to like really keep monitoring, because especially when it's at the high heat, because it'll just instantly, the second you put like the lid down, it'll just instantly kind of bubble up and want to explode, and so you kind of have to go and then back on the heat. But I mean, hey, I don't know if that's an actual legit way to cook rice, but that's what I've been doing lately ever since I read this, so it's done me well. But Rudeus then says that it's done, and Eris found herself beside him and took the pot to examine it. She says that it smells really good and tells him that he did a good job, but he's like, "No, I need to taste it first." And so much like Death God Randolph's rice, Rudeus rates it a C at best. But then he actually makes a full bowl of it and cracks a raw egg over top of it, which Eris is pretty disgusted by. And to be honest, I've always wanted to try that, but I've always been a little bit scared, especially with like North American eggs. I hear they're not good to eat raw, but I'm so curious. But Eris then tries it, and she surprisingly likes it. Unfortunately though, Ruger didn't get any, but next time, buddy, next time you'll get some. But as Dead End traveled north, they had to pass through both the Sanakia Kingdom and the Kika Kingdom, both being vassal states of the King Dragon Realm. It appears that the rice that Rudeus had back in the King Dragon Realm was exported from the Sanakia Kingdom, and so he decided to call it Sanakia rice. Is it Sanakia? Sanakia. And so normally Rudeus was a light eater, mostly just due to the food of this world not really suiting his tastes. But he had been scarfing down the rice till his stomach was bursting full, and that even surprised Eris. But food wasn't the only thing that Rudeus spent his time on. With each adventurer's guild that they passed, he'd pop his head into them. With how few people knew about Dead End on the Millis continent, it was no surprise that barely anybody even heard of Dead End on the central continent. People have definitely heard of Superts, however, but they just don't know the name of Dead End. And with that, it's not as feared over in the central continent, so it's a little bit easier and harder to spread the good word of the Superts. However, A-ranked adventurers were certainly more aware of Dead End, their party, as a man who gave off vibes similar to Nokopara came up to them and started a conversation. And he kind of picked on them about the Dead End name before realizing that he was dealing with the real thing, and he backed off. But Eris then glared at the man who walked up to them, and Rudeus asked her not to start a fight. But she goes, "Yeah, I know." Apparently, gradually throughout the past couple of years, Eris had learned to stop starting fights with random adventurers and no longer gives off the vibes of a rookie. And so, not many people approach her in an antagonistic way. However, some C-ranked and young adventurers will still come up to her and mock her, saying that she's getting carried by Rudeus and that she has no real skill, to which she gives them an Oko. Rudeus, on the other hand, when that happens with him, he has no pride and he goes like, "Oh, hell yeah. Rudeus is awesome. We are just living the high life." Eris really didn't like that attitude, but to be fair, they did have to give a lot of credit to Rudeus for getting them this far. And on top of all that, Eris had come to understand adventurer's style of humor, and when one gives a quip to her, she'd give an appropriate response. The other person would laugh while she grins back. Eris really has become a real adventurer, and that kind of, it's sweet. She's living her dream, until it gets crushed. But that's not for a little bit later. We're coming up on that soon. And so we can't move away from the food topic for too long, of course, because this is Rudeus we're talking about. He's still bitching about not having the perfect rice, or the fact that there isn't any soy sauce here. All while Eris and Rudeus just don't give a shit. Rudeus, shut up. Soy sauce is overrated in my opinion, but rice, I'll give you that. But even shitty rice is good rice in my opinion. But then again, I think that Rudeus shares that opinion. However, it turns out though that the more north you go, the better quality of rice that gets produced. However, the northern part of the central continent was currently split into a bunch of tiny countries all wrapped up in a bunch of minor conflicts. And so it's unlikely that they can really focus on cultivating perfect rice under those circumstances. However, there is a famous dish that originated in Asura called the Nanahoshi Yaki, which is the same dish that the death god Randolph served at his restaurant that Rudeus freaked out at. And however, Rudeus looked back on it, and compared to the rest of the rice dishes that Rudeus has had on his journey, Randolph actually made like some of, if not the best rice that he's ever had. Obviously not including the meals that he had in his previous life back in Japan. But as it turns out, the reason why rice is so rich in these areas of the central continent is because the topography of the Sennakia and Kika kingdoms were quite similar to the topography of Japan and East Asia. And so after they check out the adventure guilds of the towns that they visited, Rudeus complaining about the food and his search for better ingredients and searching for his family. After 4 months since the East ports, they made it to the Shirone Kingdom, which means they should be in the summer-ish of K419, I think. Maybe autumn's coming up soon. It would make sense if autumn was coming up, actually, now that I think about it. The Shirone Kingdom was a small but old country with 200 years of history. Despite the fact that there were beings that can naturally live for over 10,000 years old, you might think that it's not overly impressive. But the reason why that is a lot is because of the Laplace War 400 to 500 years ago. Every human country except for the Asura Kingdom in the holy country of Millis had been completely wiped out. The southern part of the central continent had been full of conflict until the King Dragon Realm took over the whole region about 300 years ago. And even to this day, just above Shirone is what is called the conflict zone, a place where there is just constant discord and, well, conflict. But given where the Shirone Kingdom is in relation to it, it's hard to imagine how the Shirone Kingdom has lasted for so long. And well, the reality of it is their alliance with the King Dragon Realm after it was founded. An alliance only in name, anyway. Unlike the Sanakia and Kika Kingdom, the Shirone Kingdom was basically a vassal state to the King Dragon Realm. Basically meaning that yes, it is technically ruled by the King Dragon Realm, it primarily acts independently. However, Rudeus cared little for politics and only cared for his adorable, clumsy master, and if she was still even a court magician here. She had mentioned that Pax was giving her trouble, but surely she could handle it, right? This is the great goddess Roxy we're talking about. But Rudeus longed to tell Roxy about his journey and to tell her that he met her parents and for her to hopefully teach him some king-tier magic that she can now use. Rudeus's heart thrummed in anticipation as he made his way down the road to the capital. But as they continued down the highway, Rudeus noticed that there were many rice fields and lively livestock. There were also many inactive plots of land and pastures that were just full of plants that looked like clovers. Rudeus wasn't too informed on the agricultural practices of this world, but it seemed like that many people put serious thought into what they grow and how they grow it. But it does make sense since they don't have easily accessible and larger varieties of food like we do on our world. But as Rudeus enters the Sharon Kingdom, he notes that it really doesn't look a lot like it was a part of the King Dragon Realm, and that it had a very different vibe to it. And again, personally, I would describe it as a city very similar looking to Rikarisu. But speaking of which, like Rikarisu, many of the world's major cities were surrounded by protective walls and ramparts like Roa and Militian. Both the Sanakia and Kika kingdoms had them as well as the Sharon Kingdom's capital, Latakia. Rikarisu's walls were awe-inspiring. Due to the extreme monsters found in the Demon Continent, many of their cities were boarded up with protective walls. And there wasn't a single city in the world that could rival the huge natural walls of Rikarisu. Each city in the Demon Continent utilized the special abilities of the tribes living nearby to create strong walls to protect itself, and even the small settlements conducted daily exterminations around their villages' outskirts. In comparison, the ramparts on the central continent looked as though they were merely for show, which was likely the case. There were apparently many labyrinths in the vicinity of the city and plenty scattered throughout Sharon as a whole, and so there were many tough-looking adventurers around, many of who primarily engage in dungeon diving. That's what Paul, Ghislaine, and Roxy did in the past, and it was Paul who said that dungeon divers are incredibly skilled. But even with the top-most levels of the labyrinths around here, you could make a ton of money. But Dead End found an inn suited for D-rank adventurers, despite them being able to afford a much higher-end inn. But D-rank inns aren't too cheap to begin with here, mostly due to the large amount of adventurers. And so why not save some money and go as cheap as you can? And plus, as far as D-ranked inns go, the ones in Sharon and the Central Continent were far better than even the best inns in the Demon Continent. Dead End then settled in their inn as Rudeus starts their regular meeting. Eris and Rudyard clap apathetically, and they're pretty used to this routine at this point, but Rudeus asks what they should start with, and Eris asks to confirm if they're going to meet Roxy, but that question gets Rudeus to think about why they're in Sharon in the first place. It's Hitogami's advice. He had to go to the Sharon Kingdom and will be there in the vision to meet Aisha in an alleyway. He has to call himself Kennel Master of Dead End and ask for details on her situation. And then after that, he must send a letter to Roxy in the royal palace. If he does all of that, both Lilia and Aisha will be saved from the palace. If he trusts this vision, then Rudeus is going to a sketchy alleyway to deal with some people he knows are Sharon guards that are harassing Aisha. It might be the best thing if Rudyard and Eris tagged along. He was never told that they can't, I guess, and plus ever since the incident with Paul in Militian, they've never really let Rudeus go alone anywhere. Either Rudyard or Eris was with Rudeus at basically all times. Likely, however, the reason why Hitogami wanted Rudeus to conceal his name was to keep a low profile, because by saving Aisha, they'd be making an enemy of the palace. And so that's why he'd have to use a fake name, and so when the guards are busy trying to figure out his true identity, he'll send a letter to Roxy. Because Hitogami wants Rudeus to trust him, it's unlikely that if Rudeus sticks to the plan, anything bad will happen to him, unlike the last time he took Hitogami's advice. And at this point, although Rudeus hates feeling like he's playing right into Hitogami's hands again, he really has no choice but to listen. And so, in order to do all of that, he has to make a fake name for himself and act like he isn't Rudeus. Both Eris and Rudyard are, not great at lying, essentially, and acting. And so convincing them to allow Rudeus to send a letter to Roxy, that was no problem. But being alone from them to explore some alleyways, that would be a little bit difficult to explain to them. And so after Eris notices Rudeus was worrying about something, he decided to tell them the truth. According to a source, he just so happened to forget the name. Some of his family is held captive in the country of Chiron, and even though either one or the other, Eris or Rudeus was always with Rudeus when he gathered information, they didn't question a thing and just went along with it. Rudeus tells them to conceal their names while they're at Chiron, and Eris picks up on it quickly, saying that it would be trouble if they hear the name Grey Rat. Eris asks who it was that's captured here, and Rudeus responds, telling them that it's his former maid and little sister. Although he starts to realize that simply calling Lilia a maid might be a little rude. She's kind of like his stepmother, but not really. Second mother? Purple mother? I don't know, it's kind of hard to say. But Eris goes like, your sister? The one that was full of herself back in Milesian? But Rudeus denies that and says that he has another one, to which Eris, again, she just doesn't look too pleased at. But Eris then snorts triumphantly and says, well, if that's what's going on, then no complaints here. Impressive, Rudeus, you've really thought this through. So we'll hide our names. Should we be using fake ones? And so Rudeus initially came up with using a common fake name, since they won't be too memorable. Two names that came to mind were Shaina and Radar. Shaina, the Knight of the Death God, was a female knight who appeared often in the Epic of the North God. She was one of the 3 North God knights and used to be one of the North God's companions. No matter how brutal the battle was, she would always return home, almost as though she were unkillable. Rudeus thinks that the book was fiction, which I honestly can't confirm if it is or isn't, but at this point, I feel like he needs to start realizing that things like this are just true. Someone who is known to be unkillable doesn't seem to be that much of a stretch. I mean, I believe Rudeus even knows that there are literally immortal demon races out there. And we've technically already met 2 of them, believe it or not. Although one of them was skipped in the anime, so what can you do? But many people name their daughter Shaina in hopes that the name might keep them from being killed in some freak accident. Then there's Radar, the water god. He was a master at countering attacks and could freeze the ocean and just walk on top of it, and was the hero that vanquished the Sea King Dragon. The name of the legendary man was passed through a generation, and each new head of the water god style would inherit it. Men would be called Radar and women would be called Rida. This was a pretty common name around here. And now, by that logic, we technically do know the name of the water god, I guess. However, despite all of that, Rudeus thinks that it might be best that they know it's a fake name. And so he comes up with Knight of the Shadow Moon, named after Shadow Moon from Kamen Rider. Eris's cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkled as she repeats the name in awe. Knight of the Shadow Moon. Wow. She was like, oh, I'll choose that name too, alright? Oh, wait, no, it should be a different name, shouldn't it? And so Rudeus chooses Sword of the Shadow Moon for Eris and Lance of the Shadow Moon for Rudeus. Everything is well undecided, but Eris mutters to herself that Rudeus doesn't really seem much like a knight. But it's too late now, they've chosen their names. But then again, Rudeus was told to go with Kennel Master, so it might be best just to stick with that, I guess. And now their next course of action was to send a letter to Roxy, wait for a reply, and spend time gathering information in the meantime. And so the next day, Rudeus bought an envelope, a pen, a paper, and started writing the letter. He started off with a seasonal's greeting, and asked how she's been. He informs her on his situation with being teleported and all, but assures her that he is safe. He's in Latakia, Chiron's capital, and wanted to meet with her. Emotionally manipulating her and purposefully causing concern and anxiety, he also writes that everyone from Buena Village has also been teleported away and his family is now missing. He mentions something about Lilia before closing off with his desperation that he was worried about his family. And on top of all of that, with the first letter of each line, if read vertically, it would read, "Help me." Rudeus, why? He doesn't even have to emotionally manipulate people here, but he's just doing it for the fun of it. He is a literal sociopath. He sealed it with a wax that he pressed with an imprint of Roxy's pendant and signed it with, "Your beloved pupil Rudeus Greyrat, who just wants to watch over you." Not creepy and manipulative at all, my dude. You totally could not fit perfectly as the protagonist in You, like season 5. That's awful. After he wrote the letter, he says goodbye to Rudeus and Eris, who had a glowing smile for some reason, and before he leaves, he asks what the two of them will be up to, and Eris says that she'll be asking around town for Aisha, looking for his sister. Makes sense, since he said that they'd be searching for information anyway. But Rudeus went to the Adventurers Guild to post the letter and intended to start searching afterward, but he noticed that he was being tailed by someone. He weaves his way through the alleyways, which are far more confusing than the grid-like layout in Milesian. These ones aren't windy and don't run straight, But Rudeus created a fake wall, which he soon heard something like weakly slap against it, and it's poor Aisha. And as Rudeus walked away, he realized that this was the alleyway that he saw in his vision. And so he walked back, took down the wall, and saw Aisha being held by the hand by one of the guards as the other guard tore up her letter. They looked as though they didn't want to do this, and I mean, they were making a child bawl their eyes out after all, so of course no one would love to do this. And Rudeus nearly introduces himself as Aisha's brother, but then he says that he is the Knight of the Shadow Moon. But the guards are like, what? You're obviously a magician, dude. What are you doing? But because the guards were distracted by Rudeus, Aisha escaped their grasp and clung onto Rudeus. She then cries out, and let me quote, "Those guys took my letter and tore it up." I kid you not, that is exactly what is wrote. Letter for letter. And so Rudeus fires a stone cannon at one of the guards, which he deflected using his sword that he unsheathed. Really great reaction timing there. And this is apparently the first time that anyone has ever, deflected one of Rudeus' stone cannons before. And so the guards recognized Rudeus based on his ability to do silent spellcasting as he fired more stone cannons to distract them. Rudeus asks if Aisha can run, and she goes, yeah. What can I say? Aisha, a master at her words, right? She knows exactly what she wants. But before they can make their escape, one of the guards blows a whistle, which causes a lot of backup to arrive. And so they resort to plan B. And so Rudeus tells Aisha, who is still clinging on to him, to hold on tight and to not let go no matter what. Despite her confusion, Aisha wrapped her arms around Rudeus' waist and squeezed. He grabbed her shirt with his left hand and channeled his mana into his right and conjured an earth lance with a flattened tip at his feet and used it like a catapult, launching himself up. However, upon landing somewhere else, he broke both of his legs, and so there's no way that he's ever doing that again. Back at the inn, Rudeus noticed that at some point Aisha had peed herself in fear and was still sobbing uncontrollably as her body shakes. He goes, yeah, I understand what she's feeling. I'd be shaking too if a couple men grabbed me and threatened me. I mean, I wouldn't pee myself. What, am I a baby? Now, this is something I normally wouldn't go into too much detail about because it's not exactly suitable for most audiences, but I think it's important at least to discuss and to show off more of Rudeus' character. And so, in response to Aisha peeing herself, Rudeus strips her and gives her one of his shirts and washes her clothing and panties while she sits on the bed. Still crying, mind you. Now, Rudeus goes on to a whole page-and-a-half rant about why he has no idea why he isn't horny in this situation. The way that he describes it, there's his sister, a vulnerable child who's crying in his bed wearing nothing but his shirt while he washes her piss-soaked panties. That is one of the most... Why isn't he turned on? That is one of the most disgusting sentences I've ever read. I can fundamentally agree with some of what he says. A girl wearing your shirt. That's great. But I don't agree with anything else that he said before. And even with context, you should never be horny when your girl cries. And of course, in the context of this situation, it's just awful for him to be thinking about that. It's really bad. But we do learn a couple things here about Rudeus. One is Rudeus in his past life never really cared about gender or age. He's progressive, but in some really bad ways. And so that explains a lot, actually. And two, ever since coming to this world, for some reason, family has always been off limits to him. He's never been attracted to his family members despite them all fitting within his criteria. Basically just have lots of personality. But it is sad that I even have to say that, right? But I think that the reason why it's important is to not only show that Rudeus is really flawed, but it also means that his morals from the previous world almost they kind of perfectly align with the morals of the six-faced world. Rudeus is almost a physical representation of this world's morals. Is he an awful person? By our world's standards? Yes, absolutely. But is he awful in the eyes of that world? Sometimes, sure, but he fits really well and he feels almost like he was destined to be reborn in this world. It's almost like it was fate. We all think that the six-faced world is great, but since realizing that Rudeus is basically the physical embodiment of that world, you start to question, is the six-faced world evil? And I might have mentioned it a couple times by now, but I definitely want to make a video about the morals of Mushoku Tensei. And so I'll get to that eventually, but that question rather, is the six-faced world evil? I definitely have an answer for that. But I'll get to that eventually one day. And so I'll eventually get that video out and answer, is the six-faced world evil? Because I think that's an interesting question. It might be worded weirdly, but I just wanted to bring this little scene up just to get you to know Rudeus a little bit more, even if you didn't want to. But anyway, as Rudeus finishes cleaning up Aisha's clothes, she had stopped crying at some point, and he let her change back into her regular maid uniform. She then introduced herself and thanked Rudeus as she bowed, letting her little ponytail sway with the motion. And Rudeus says that ponytails really were amazing, and I could not agree more, Rudeus. Ponytails were God's greatest invention. Change my mind. But apparently Eris had occasionally pulled hers back into one, but it looked more like a girl in a sports club. But Aisha, on the other hand, looked more like an adorable doll. Her eyes were bloodshot though, so more like a cursed doll, I guess. But Aisha refers to Rudeus as Sir Knight, as she thanked him multiple times and bowed her head just as much. Rudeus notes that Aisha had been very polite, and he's impressed with Lilia's teachings. Aisha then asks if Rudeus could help her send a letter to Paul, and Rudeus asks if she has money, and she declares, "I have no money." And very matter of fact, kind of like Eris, which she does sometimes. But she does say that Lilia had taught her that if she wants a letter sent, look at someone with a pleading look in her eyes and ask to send a letter to their father. Rudeus then immediately takes back his compliments about Lilia's teachings. But then he thinks about it for a moment and realizes that much of Aisha's mannerisms started to feel very staged. Just what was Lilia teaching her? But Rudeus asks if she has anybody else to turn to, which the conversation eventually leads to her and what Lilia had said about him. She praised him for being a king-tier magician and for becoming a tutor for the region's liege lord, among other things. But Aisha claims that her mother must have been lying. Why? Well, it's because her brother worshipped panties. How awful. He's such a pervert. But then Aisha asks for Rudeus' name, which he says that he is Kennel Master, and Aisha suspects that he can do summoning magic, but he denies that and says that he can, however, control two very ferocious dogs. And she goes, "Oh, that's amazing!" Aisha had a sparkle in her eye and looked at him like a puppy, and he felt bad about deceiving said puppy, but it's to save his reputation after all. If he doesn't lie to her, she might not trust him, and plus she is terribly mistaken about her thoughts on her older brother. Sure, I think based on the conversation that we just had, I don't think that she's mistaken at all, but for now it's best to act now and talk later. But then Aisha throws Rudeus another curveball question. How did you know my name? Rudeus kind of scrambled for an excuse until he finally spotted her name embroidered somewhere on the edge of her clothes. I guess up there. Aisha then told him details of the past 2 years. Although she kind of struggled with the details, he got the gist of what she was saying. Basically, she and Lilia had been teleported inside the Shrone Kingdom's royal palace. Obviously being suspicious, they were detained and arrested. And although Lilia had tried to explain the situation, none would listen to her. They weren't even allowed to send a single letter out, and yet 2.5 years later, they were still imprisoned. This was Lilia we're talking about here. Surely she could have talked her way out of the situation by then, unless there were other factors at play that Rudeus wasn't aware of. But Aisha somehow got out, wrote the letter to Paul, and decided to follow an adventurer to get her to the Adventurers Guild. And that is when she met Rudeus. They got cornered by the guards and escaped. However, through all of that, Aisha didn't mention Roxy for whatever reason. Was Roxy not helping for some reason? Or perhaps was she working from the shadows? But as they discussed that, Aisha was quite curious to hear more about Rudeus, and so he said that he was caught up in the displacement incident in Fedoa, became a teacher to a noble's daughter in Roa, and Aisha wondered if Rudeus had ever passed by her brother at some point, but he quickly denies that. She asks since that they were both teaching nobles, maybe their families got in contact at some point, but again, Rudeus still denies that. She was hoping that she could get her opinion on what her brother was like, until he kind of scrambles to say that he heard that the young miss at the liege lord's manor was quite violent and impossible to manage. And as they were talking, Rudeus was really impressed with how well Aisha was able to keep up with the conversation and talk with him. Although she might have been just pretending to act like an adult, she was doing a good job at it. But they soon moved on to talk about the demon continent, to this and then to that. Rudeus was worried that he might not have much to talk about with Aisha, but he was pleasantly surprised. It was really nice to have what was basically the first real conversation that he had with either of his sisters. And now a few hours later, Aisha fell asleep and Rudeus and Eris returned at sunset. They'd all gone their ways to their slums to gather information, and it appeared that they had gotten into a fight. This happened somewhat often. They looked apologetic, but since this wasn't anything new, Rudeus didn't ask for details. But from there, Rudeus explained what happened with Aisha and to not use their real names. Hearing that Lilia was trapped in the castle, Eris was excited to go storm it, and even Rudeus said, it's been a while since I've stormed a castle. And he lifted his spear ready to go. But they're not storming any castle, and the next day at noon, Ginger had come to visit Rudeus, requesting his presence at the royal palace because Roxy wished for it. Rudeus packs his things, thinking that he wants to bring sweets, and of course, there's the Rudeus figure to bring her, to let her know that he was the one that made the figure of her, and so he obviously brought that as well. He packed a few other things here and there before bidding farewell, but naturally everyone was a little bit anxious about this. Anytime Rudeus was alone, something bad had happened, and now that I think about it, that's really true. I get why they're overprotective of Rudeus now. And not just Eris and Rudeus were worried, though, Aisha was also worried, and so Rudeus patted her on the head as she forced a thin smile and nodded. Rudeus and Ginger then head for the royal palace, and along the way the roads had so many twists and turns that not even carriages could freely pass. This was likely in case of an enemy attack, but as they were walking, a voice could be heard in the distance yelling, "Okay, up next, this one. She used to be a knight from the county of Washua. This is a battle-ready slave. She's a bit of a feisty one, but she is skilled. 3 gold coins. Do I hear 3 gold coins?" A slave market occupied an area facing the main road. On a tall platform was a line of slaves, 3 human and 1 rabbit beast folk woman. There were 2 women and 2 men, all topless and seemingly oiled up to make themselves look a little bit more attractive. The merchant explained various things about the slave as Rudeus thought how scary it was that Lilia and Aisha could have been there. Thankfully, despite the rough situation, he at least knew where they were, kind of. But Rudeus noticed Ginger looking off at the slave market with a wrinkle in her brow. Her duty was to maintain public order in this country, and seeing that was just unpleasant. Rudeus asks why the slave market is here of all places, since the slave markets were usually nestled further back within cities, not on the main road. Although slavery wasn't exactly a bad thing in this world, having them just be sold out on the main streets was a little bit much. However, the reason for this is because some adventurers the previous day had gotten into a fight in an area where the markets usually were, and so it can't be used at the moment. I wonder what 2 adventurers did that. But seeing Rudeus' interest in the market, she grabbed him from under the arms and lifted him up. As it turns out, Roxy would be curious about such things as well. Not necessarily about slavery, but for events and whatnot. And so Roxy would hop up and down complaining I can't really see. And so Ginger would pick her up, but then immediately Roxy wanted down. And so, being distracted by the main reason for him going to the palace in the first place, Rudeus asks Ginger to put him down as they continue on their way. The 2 talked about Roxy while walking, and it turns out that although Roxy obviously taught Pax, in her off time she had also trained with the swordsman. The Sharon Knights were all intermediate tier water god sword fighters, but thanks to Roxy and their training, they could also deflect magic easily as well. Their training would basically be them sparring against each other while Roxy fires random spells at them which they'd have to deflect. That's why the guard was able to easily deflect Rudeus' stone cannon. And as it turns out, Roxy used to praise Rudeus just as much as he praised her, and she claimed that she wasn't qualified to teach someone like him. But eventually, Rudeus and Ginger made their way to the palace, which was pretty big, but it was still smaller than Kishiriku Castle in Rikurisu and smaller than the White Palace in Militian. It was probably about the size of the Boreas estate, which means that this entire country was essentially the same size as a single region of the Asura kingdom. God damn. And I think that would also mean that the Boreas family would have been just as rich as the Sharon kingdom itself. But as the 2 walked through the back entrance, because the front entrance is for nobles, many guards, some of which were playing some kind of card game, all said, "Thank you for your dedicated service." Ginger explains that among the guards she was ranked about 12th. No idea what that exactly means, but if she's ranking above all of the guards in Sharon Kingdom, 12 was certainly something to be impressed by. But soon they made their way to what Rudeus thinks is Roxy's room, and Pax answers the door from the other side. Beside him were 2 maids. Let's call them Maid A and Maid B. And as it turns out though, maid B was Lilia, and she was gagged and tied to a chair. As Rudeus entered the room, Pax goes, "Oh, so this is Rudeus, huh?" Drop him. Suddenly the floor beneath Rudeus had vanished. Falling into a small room on top of a magic circle barrier, he tried to use magic but couldn't. He felt the mana flow out of his body, but nothing really happened with it. Pax shows his ugly mug from the top and explains a little bit of the situation to Rudeus, saying that Roxy isn't here. And Rudeus goes like, "What? Roxy isn't here? That meant that God wasn't here. There is no God. No, that couldn't be possible. Did not the great mathematician Euler claim that God existed? Did he not receive an order from Catherine the Great and magnificently offer up proof that God was real? God did exist. I would do the same and prove that God existed myself. No, God is here." And Pax goes like, "What? God?" He's like, "That's right, God. Make no mistake, if God wasn't here, there would be a holy war." Rudeus, chill the f*** out. Chill, my dude. After that, Rudeus calmed down, as Pax says that Rudeus is going to be bait to lure Roxy back. And Rudeus goes, "Hey, if you mean that she's gonna swallow me up, then that's been my lifelong dream, brother." Pax, kind of ignoring that comment, said that he was surprised that her lover would suddenly show up in this country. But Rudeus freaks out and goes like, "What? Roxy has a lover? Seriously?" And Pax is kind of confused and goes like, "What, you're not her lover?" And he's like, "Don't be ridiculous. That's unthinkable. I am an unworthy apprentice. There's no way that such a relationship would develop between us." But they talk more about what Pax will do once he gets Roxy, and Rudeus realizes that this guy is, he's just a moron. And he thinks that Roxy will magically find out about this, that he and Lilia were here. But then he realizes something. Roxy said that he and Pax were alike. The two of them being similar? No. That can't be right. Did Roxy really think that lowly of Rudeus? That's pretty bad. But as they spoke, Pax turned around and yelled at one of the guards, saying, "Who said you could remove Lilia's gag?" They thought that she had something to say, but Pax says that that isn't their decision to make. Lilia then pleads and says, "Please, your highness, I don't care what you do with me, but please spare Lord Rudeus." He then smacks her and says that he doesn't need anything from an old hag like her. He then asks the status on finding Aisha, and the guards report nothing and claim that the one who took her was a big, large, perverted man who jumped across the building screaming like a lunatic. It seems the guards from yesterday really are kind and are on Rudeus' side. I mean, they're trying to protect who it was that, saved Aisha. Ginger says that a high-ranking noble isn't going to take action just because of a children's letter, and that it might be best just to forget about her. Pax goes, No, go search for her. Don't you care about what happens to your family? And, yeah, it's clear that these guards just don't really care much for Pax, and they're only doing what he tells them to do because he has their families hostage. Lilia then screams, "Oh, Lord Rudeus, I'll save you!" But Pax, angry, tells her to shut up and says that he will behead her in front of Roxy too. He then proceeds to smack Lilia as someone seemingly drags her across the floor back to her cell. Oddly enough though, perhaps because of the shock of Roxy not being here, or because of Hitogami said that Lilia will be saved, Rudeus wasn't really angry about what happened. But then he thought about something. Hitogami told him to tell Aisha that he was Kennel Master. So what if when he told the guards that he was Knight of the Shadow Moon, he messed things up? And maybe sending the letter to Roxy under his real name was a mistake as well. And not only that, he did it before he ran into Aisha. His anxiety started to build up before he forcibly pushed it down. Now was not the time to panic. Now was the time to secure an escape route. Next time. Not this time. I was just about to say next time on Dragon Ball Z. But this isn't Dragon Ball Z. And so yeah, that was quite a bit. Just a lot of extended scenes, pretty much. A lot of unnecessary details that you're welcome, by the way, now you know. And we just kind of get to know Aisha a little bit more, which is really nice. Aisha is one of my favorite and least favorite characters in the series for reasons. I could explain why she's my favorite, and because she's just awesome. There is one image in the light novel of her and someone else. They're sitting behind a desk, and I love it. It is my favorite image of Aisha. But then there's also something else that she does later on that I don't like. But we get to know Aisha. I love Norn as well. I love both of his sisters. They're great people. But that is it for this review today. What did you think about all the additions? Which, this was a very long episode. And remember, we skipped the manga today. We skipped it, and it was still this long. And so if you did enjoy this review, though, and are excited for more, because we are coming up to like the big final few episodes of the season, hit that like button, subscribe, ring that bell for those notifications, and God, I feel like a douchebag asking for that. I'm fine with like asking for you to like the video and subscribe, but the notification thing, that's a bit too much. Do what you want, really. I mean, you've watched this far all the way. You might as well subscribe at this point. If you're willing to tolerate me for... I've been here for like an hour and 40 minutes. So if you're willing to tolerate me for at least 50 minutes, I would imagine, might as well subscribe for more.